in the Lord. In the power of his might. He is strong in the Lord.
Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Van Helsing is an iconic Gothic hero of our times. People around the world famously know him as the one who battled the undead Dracula. While Dracula has inspired a multitude of vampire movies in Hollywood and the rest of the world, Van Helsing is no less. The character has been used and even upgraded and modernized in various films, TV shows, and even comics. Most famously, Hugh Jackman played Van Helsing in the 2004 movie named after the character. Are you a fan of this monster-slaying vampire expert? Keep watching because today's video will trace the history and evolution of Van Helsing. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The character was immortalized in Bram Stoker's Dracula. The character of Van Helsing was first introduced in Bram Stoker's Dracula. In this novel, he's less of a monster slayer and more of a scientist and physician who's an expert in the field of rare and obscure diseases. He's known to be a man who appears arbitrary, but this is only because he's an expert in his field. He's also described as being one of the most accomplished scientists of his time, a philosopher and a metaphysician who has an unwaveringly open mind. This, along with nerves of steel, a frosty temper, unwavering resolve, self-control, and the kindest and most sincere heart, serves as his tools for the noble work he does for humanity. Work that is being done both in theory and in practice, because his viewpoints are as broad as his all-encompassing sympathy. What is cool about this character is that Van Helsing was based on a real individual, according to Stoker, who stated this in an 1897 interview with the British Weekly. The character of Van Helsing is based on a well-known scientist in real life, according to Stoker's 1898 preface to the Swedish and Icelandic translations of the book. However, he never discloses his inspiration's name since he thinks it's important to keep it a secret from the general public for safety purposes. Moving on to the story, in the book, Professor Van Helsing is contacted by John Seward, a former pupil, for help with Lucy Westenra's puzzling illness. The connection between Van Helsing and Seward is partially based on an untold past incident in which Van Helsing had a terrible wound and Seward rescued him by drawing out the gangrene. Van Helsing is the one who first discerns that Lucy is a vampire's victim, and he aids Seward and his companions, which include Arthur Holmwood and Quincy Morris, Lucy's suitors, Mina Murray, her best friend Jonathan Harker, Mina's husband, in their attempts to save Lucy. In his attempts to save the young noblewoman, he performs numerous blood transfusions. She receives blood donations from Van Helsing, Seward, Arthur, and Morris. Yet, every night she continues to lose more and more blood. He then gives her garlic pills, creates for her a necklace out of garlic flowers, and hangs garlic all over her bedroom. Additionally, he offers her a crucifix to wear as a necklace. However, he is unfortunately unable to save Lucy. Her mother, who had removed the garlic from the chamber and opened the window to let in some fresh air, was responsible for Lucy's death. Not only was the garlic guarding her gone, but a servant had also taken the gold cross given to her by Van Helsing. Even in death, poor Lucy doesn't find peace and she returns as a vampire to hunt down young people. Van Helsing, Arthur, Morris, and Seward eventually succeed in releasing the undead Lucy from her vampire curse. Van Helsing slashes off her head and places garlic in her mouth after Arthur uses a hammer to push a stake through her heart. However, their story doesn't end there. Mina and Harker learn that Dracula is in fact real and that Jonathan's experiences in Transylvania were not made up by him. This leads to the group doing further investigation on the Count, and they learn that Dracula lives close to Seward's residence in Carfax. Van Helsing further researches Dracula's vulnerabilities and strengths in an effort to gather information so as to confront and defeat him. The group gets together and stays at Seward's house to strategize their attacks on Dracula, and each person is tasked with various duties. They also find out that Count Dracula has been buying homes all over London with the intention of placing in them 50 boxes of Transylvanian earth to serve as graves, turning each house into a secure hideaway for himself. When they get to these hideouts, they put sacramental bread in the earthen containers to sterilize them and keep Dracula from utilizing them again. It's shortly after this that they run into Dracula, who seems to be aware of their plans and kills one of Seward's patients, Renfield. Dracula's carnage doesn't stop there, and he gives Mina the vampire's baptism of blood to punish her and the rest of the group for trying to stop him. This allows him access to her thoughts telepathically and curses her with vampirism. This turns Mina allergic to things like sacramental bread, but it also allows the group to track Dracula because of their shared connection. However, they keep their plans a secret from her because if she knew, so would Dracula. As they continue to look for and locate Dracula's homes throughout London and disinfect the boxes, the party has more encounters with him. Van Helsing theorizes that Dracula is escaping back to his castle after learning that his last resting place is on a boat that will presumably carry him back to Transylvania. The group disperses into two teams as they pursue Dracula. The others try to intercept Dracula's boat while Mina and Van Helsing head straight for Dracula's castle. In an effort to halt them, Dracula's 3 vampire wives surround their camp as Mina's health and mental condition continue to deteriorate. However, they're unable to cause the pair any harm and go back to Dracula's castle. Later, when he enters Dracula's castle to slaughter the vampires, Van Helsing locks Mina in a cave to keep her safe. Van Helsing discovers Dracula's vacant tomb and the 3 female vampires he previously encountered as he searches the castle's chambers. He starts the first vampire's operation, but he's overcome by her beauty and finds it difficult to bring himself to hurt her. Nevertheless, he's freed from this magic and goes on to sever each of their heads and drive stakes into their hearts. Then Van Helsing goes back to Mina. Finally, the other team catches up and cracks open the last Dracula box. In the last minutes of daylight, Jonathan Harker slashes Dracula's throat with a kukiri knife as Quincy Morris impales Dracula's heart with a Bowie knife, killing Dracula for good. In the end, all is well that ends well, and 6 years later, Van Helsing adopts a grandfather role toward little Quincy Harker, the son of Jonathan and Mina. This novel puts forward the idea of a scientist and physician as one being able to take down a terrifying villain such as Count Dracula via meticulous research and methodical planning. He's shown to be extremely smart along with being fearless and physically adept as well. The role of Van Helsing as a vampire expert has frequently been emphasized in film adaptations of the book, sometimes to the point that it's presented as his primary profession. However, that is definitely not the case in the book, which entails the original portrayal of the character.
More effective than Wolfbane, Count. Indeed.
Dracula, 1931, saw the first adaptation of the character. The 1931 American supernatural gothic horror film Dracula, with Bela Lugosi in the title role, was directed and co-produced by Todd Browning from a screenplay by Garrett Fort. It's based on the 1924 stage adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, written by Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston, which is in turn based on the original novel by Bram Stoker. Dracula is also the first sound movie version of the Bram Stoker novel, and it was produced and released by Universal Pictures. In his role as Count Dracula, played by Bela Lugosi, the vampire leaves Transylvania for England, where he feeds on the blood of people, killing them one by one. There is only one man with the wits to be able to stop him, and that is none other than Van Helsing himself. On the big screen, Edward Van Sloan recreated his Broadway stage performance of Van Helsing opposite Bela Lugosi. Despite Van Helsing becoming one of his most well-known on-screen performances, Van Sloan didn't give the movie much thought or credit. However, Sloan himself is a renowned American actor. He starred in a number of horror movies, most of which were produced by Universal Pictures, and he's arguably best known for his performance as Professor Van Helsing in Todd Browning's Dracula. The movie deviates from the original story plot in a number of ways, essentially telling a whole different story altogether, just with familiar elements. In this movie, Renfield is not a madman. Instead, he's a solicitor who has been hired by Dracula. Renfield makes his way to Dracula's castle in Transylvania, and during his journey, he's told by many not to go to the castle, since the locals believe that the infamous vampire lives in the gloomy Gothic castle. Renfield, however, ignores their warnings and continues on. Upon reaching Dracula's castle, he meets the infamous vampire in the flesh, and once their business dealings are done, Dracula attacks Renfield, drinking his blood and turning him into a bloodthirsty madman. Renfield thus becomes enslaved to Dracula and acts as his crazy yet loyal servant, as Dracula decides to journey all the way from Transylvania to London. During their journey, Dracula kills every last person on the ship apart from Renfield to sustain himself. Upon reaching London, Dracula escapes from the boat and begins feeding on people. Renfield, on the other hand, is discovered alive on the boat and is promptly sent to the Carfax Abbey, adjacent Dr. Seward's sanitarium. Seward and Dracula meet in a London theatre somewhere else, and Seward introduces Lucy Weston, a family acquaintance, as well as his daughter Mina and her fiancé, John Harker. Dracula, for some reason, piques young Lucy's interest, and that evening, when she's sleeping, Dracula enters her room and begins to feed on her blood. Even though she's given numerous blood transfusions in an effort to save her, she ultimately passes away. It's here that Van Helsing enters the scene. He examines Renfield and starts to connect the dots between Renfield's apparent manic behavior and Lucy's untimely demise. Unbeknownst to them, Lucy promptly comes back from the dead as a vampire and begins to hunt down children. Post Lucy's death, Dracula attacks Mina while she's sleeping in her bedroom, biting her and draining her blood. He later arrives for a visit the following evening, but Van Helsing and Harker discover that he lacks a reflection. This alerts Van Helsing, and he makes the deduction that Dracula is the vampire responsible for the recent tragedies. Dracula once again attacks Mina after she exits her room and runs into him in the garden. A weakened Mina is discovered by the maid, and Harker initially wishes to take her away for her own safety, before deciding to leave her with Van Helsing, who takes on the responsibility of caring for her. Nurse Briggs is instructed by Van Helsing to look after Mina while she sleeps and to refrain from removing the wolfsbane garland that he places from her neck. During this time, Renfield breaks out of his cell and overhears the men talking about vampires. Renfield tells them how Dracula persuaded Renfield to let him into the sanatorium by promising him thousands of rats full of blood and life before they took him back to his cell, which is quite disturbing if you really think about it. Dracula then enters the Seaward parlor and engages Van Helsing in conversation. He tells Van Helsing to go back to his native land and declares that Mina is now his property, quite openly admitting that he's indeed a vampire and was also responsible for the various deaths across the city. However, not being one to back down from a battle, Van Helsing promises to destroy Dracula and dig Carfax Abbey. In fact, during this time, Van Helsing is also able to avoid being hypnotized by Dracula simply by using his sheer willpower. Van Helsing pulls a crucifix from his coat as Dracula lunges at him, compelling the vampire to back off, ending their confrontation for the time being. Mina's condition keeps worsening and Dracula's influence over her keeps growing day by day. On a fateful day, Nurse Briggs is compelled by Dracula using hypnosis to open the windows and remove the wolfsbane from Mina's neck. Once the wolfsbane is removed, Dracula whisks her away to his lair. Luckily, during the same time, Renfield is seen traveling toward Carfax Abbey by Van Helsing and Harker, who decide to follow him. When they get there, they discover Mina and Dracula. Dracula believes Renfield betrayed him by sending them there, instead of realizing that the two men had simply followed the unassuming madman and killed him. Van Helsing and Harker subsequently chase after Dracula since they're aware that he must sleep in his coffin during the daytime as the sun rises. They split up and Harker looks for Mina while Van Helsing prepares a wooden stake. In the end, Dracula is killed when Van Helsing stabs him in the heart. Thus, in this film too, Van Helsing is largely the protagonist of the story, but the characters and the way that the story plays out are quite different. Hugh Jackman stole the show in the 2004 Van Helsing movie. Hugh Jackman's portrayal of Van Helsing is definitely the furthest away from the original source material written by Bram Stoker. However, the portrayal in the 2004 Van Helsing movie modernized the age-old character in a way no one had imagined, making it a cult classic and somewhat of a masterpiece. The action horror movie Van Helsing was written and directed by Stephen Sommers in 2004. Hugh Jackman plays Van Helsing, a Dutch monster hunter, and Kate Beckinsale plays Anna Valerius, the female lead. Sommers is a devotee of the Universal horror monster movies from the 1930s and 40s, and Van Helsing is both a homage and a tribute to them. Bram Stoker's Dracula introduced the figure of Van Helsing, an elderly doctor who was engaged in the study of the supernatural. The character, as portrayed by Hugh Jackman, is an amnesic demon hunter for the Vatican. In this movie, the Vatican is essentially MI6 for 19th century Europe. They produce gadgets such as the machine gun crossbow, several Batman-inspired grappling hooks, and spinning blades, and comical sidekick Friar Carl's sunshine bomb in a secret basement populated with religious experts from all over the world. With all of these things at his disposal, Van Helsing can defeat any vampire or monster. Sommers immediately establishes that the Van Helsing shown in the movie is not the same as the one in Bram Stoker's well-known book. Instead, this is Gabriel Van Helsing, a character who seems to have existed throughout time and has been cursed to battle evil forces forever without being able to recall his past. Gabriel Van Helsing is an immortal action hero who uses a mechanized crossbow to dispatch vampires, werewolves, and other horrific monsters like Mr. Hyde, in contrast to Dracula's Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, a scientist and skilled vampire hunter. This Van Helsing manages to be a lot cooler than past character upgrades. Gabriel Van Helsing's version explains virtually nothing, other than the fact that he's a bit more agile and fights many supernatural foes with ease, whereas the Dracula novel explains a lot about the decent Roman Catholic professor who leads the battle against the great vampire. Additionally, the fact that a handsome young Hugh Jackman is behind that black hat only serves to enhance the appeal of this vampire slayer's youthful appearance and charisma. By creating a modernized version of the classic figure, the movie assumes control of its own narrative, no longer constrained by the parameters of the first Dracula novel and able to take the hero in an entirely new direction. The story is super action-packed, so buckle up. The movie opens with a scene that takes us all the way back to the year 1887, when Dr. Victor Frankenstein, his assistant Igor, and Count Dracula together create a monster. However, the townspeople storm Frankenstein's castle, and in the commotion, Dracula kills Dr. Frankenstein. However, the monster escapes with Frankenstein's body. This is very important in the film, since Dracula's main motivation, as per the plotline, is to use Dr. Frankenstein's formula to bring to life thousands of his undead progeny. The crossbow-slinging Van Helsing appears in the next scene, and we see him kill the monster Mr. Hyde and return to the Vatican. Van Helsing is then given the mission to go to Transylvania, kill Dracula and safeguard Anna and Velkan, Valerius, the last members of an ancient Romanian family. Their ancestor had made a vow that his offspring would either kill Dracula or perish in purgatory. Thus, Van Helsing was to aid in their quest. Anna and Velkan continue their fight against Dracula while Van Helsing makes his way to them. However, when Anna and Velkan try to kill a werewolf that Dracula is controlling in Transylvania, the werewolf manages to bite Velkan as it falls with Velkan into a narrow river canyon. Once Van Helsing and Karl, a weapons inventor and friar, reach Transylvania, they aid Anna in her battle with Verona, Mariska, and Alira, Dracula's 3 wives, killing Mariska in the process. The following evening, Velkan goes to see Anna to inform her of Dracula's plans, but he changes into a werewolf and flees instead. Van Helsing and Anna pursue the werewolf to Dr. Frankenstein's castle, where they find out Dracula's true motivations as they stumble upon thousands of unborn, undead vampires, all waiting to be brought to life by Dracula using Frankenstein's formula. They also run into Dracula, and in a mysterious turn of events, Dracula addresses Van Helsing as his ancient rival. Due to the absence of Frankenstein's original formula, Dracula's spawns come to life, but they quickly pass away as well. In the chaos, when Van Helsing and Anna manage to flee, they discover Frankenstein's monster at a windmill, who confesses that he's the key to Frankenstein's device that will allow Dracula's offspring to come to life. Near Budapest, Velkan and the brides ambush Van Helsing and his team as they attempt to transport Frankenstein's monster to Rome to keep him away from the clutches of Dracula. Van Helsing is bitten in battle, and Verona and Velkan are killed. Later, at a masquerade ball, Alira kidnaps Anna and promises to exchange her for Frankenstein's monster. However, Anna is rescued by Van Helsing. But in the meanwhile, Dracula's minions manage to capture Frankenstein's monster. This is also the time that Dracula's history is finally revealed in the movie. Karl reveals that Dracula is the son of Valerius the Elder at Anna's castle. Dracula forged a deal with the devil and was able to resurrect himself after being killed in 1462 by the left hand of God, otherwise known as the angel Gabriel. It was instructed to Valerius that by killing Dracula, he would save his entire family. However, he locked his son in an icy fortress since he was unable to murder him. This also explains his connection to Van Helsing, since in this movie, Van Helsing's full name is Gabriel Van Helsing, hinting at the idea that Hugh Jackman's Van Helsing was indeed none other than Angel Gabriel, who had killed Dracula the first time around, sparking their ancient rivalry. Further, Karl also figures out it was prophesied that a werewolf would kill the ancient vampire, giving Van Helsing the edge since he had also been bitten by a werewolf and was slowly beginning to turn. They set out to find Frankenstein's monster, and when they finally locate him, he tells them that Dracula has developed a treatment for lycanthropy because only a werewolf can put an end to him. In an effort to find this cure, Van Helsing dispatches Anna and Karl, killing Igor and Alira in the process. When Van Helsing tries to liberate Frankenstein's monster, lightning strikes him, resurrecting Dracula's offspring. However, the final battle comes down to the ancient two, Dracula and Van Helsing. They fight in their monstrous forms, one as a vampire and another as a werewolf. When they both momentarily transform back into humans, Dracula explains that Van Helsing was the one who killed him and subsequently offers to revive his memory. However, after changing back into a werewolf, Van Helsing rejects Dracula's offer and kills him, killing his entire family in the process. Anna subsequently arrives and administers the werewolf cure to Van Helsing, but she dies in the process. In the end, she is reunited with her family as her spirit finds them in heaven, and Gabriel Van Helsing departs, presumably to go back to the Vatican and continue ridding the world of dangerous evil. The movie abandons the traditional monster stories in favor of an original one that keeps viewers on the edge of their seats by mixing these supernatural beings and their tales into a single work with new characters, unexpected twists, and sometimes even totally new plots. Van Helsing consistently demonstrates that it's a unique interpretation of some of the finest literary classics ever written, whether it be by having Frankenstein's monster and Van Helsing decide to cooperate, or by learning the sinister reason behind Dracula's animosity toward our favorite vampire hunter. Van Helsing is also given a unique history in this adaptation as he's shown to be God's right hand, the angel Gabriel. In his actual form, Gabriel is a powerful archangel. He was capable of obliterating entire cities thanks to his enormous destructive strength. However, the Gabriel Van Helsing that we see on screen is human. The story follows that Gabriel eventually came down to earth and transformed into a human being by taking on live flesh. Gabriel fought in numerous significant conflicts during his life as a human. Notably, he met Count Vladislaus Dracula while serving the Knights of the Holy Order sometime in the 1460s, and they became good friends. Because Dracula had violated the Knights of the Holy Order's oath of celibacy by trying to use dark magic to reinstate the life of the lady he loved after she had been banished and murdered, Gabriel was forced to kill him during a fierce struggle for reasons that remain a mystery. Gabriel then implored God to remove his memory in order to escape his guilt, and God complied. Gabriel then wandered the planet for the next 400 years before being discovered half dead and stumbling up the Vatican steps one day after a fight, again with no memory. He was dispatched to train in the art of combat with monks and mullahs from Tibet to Istanbul, under the guidance of the Vatican, in order to battle the forces of darkness. Thus, he became a skilled fighter as he unconsciously prepared for the day that he would meet Vlad the Impaler, once again to fulfill his destiny. The movie is seen as a classic by many, and it's easy to see why. Van Helsing. The London Assignment tells you the prequel story. The London Assignment is essentially the live-action movie's animated predecessor. It's challenging to classify this story in a conventional manner given that it lasts only 33 minutes. Clearly, it's too short in length to qualify as a standalone movie and a little too long to qualify as a TV special. However, the non-stop action in this plot makes any additional trimming unnecessary. Hugh Jackman provides the voice for Van Helsing in The London Assignment, which is a brief account of Helsing's initial encounters with the dangerous Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in London. The animated movie does a respectable job of capturing the gloomy and dismal vibe of its live-action counterpart, even if the format is very different with this one being animated. Additionally, it was a great choice to cast Jackman as the character's voice, which helps to create a more convincing resemblance. The movie has more action than most long-form movies do. The character development suffers as a result, of course, but the movie still manages to go along quickly. The plot is an action-packed hunt to look into a string of gruesome murders that the deranged Dr. Jekyll, as his evil alter ego Mr. Hyde, is committing. Monster hunter Gabriel Van Helsing and Friar Carl, his sidekick, come to London. Once in London, Van Helsing and Carl find a young woman claimed to be Queen Victoria while following Hyde to his underground lair. Upon meeting her, they learn that Dr. Jekyll is obsessively in love with this lady. They also find out that she is in fact the Queen and the reigning monarch of the British royal family, and was given a potion by Dr. Jekyll that transformed her into a young woman for one night, since he wanted to woo her and marry her. This potion also made her delusional, and all she remembered was that she was the Queen and the doctor was curing her of a horrible illness. Her delusion caused her to think that she was only 20 years old and that she was in love with the royal physician, Dr. Jekyll. He imprisoned her in an underground lair in order to keep her young and hence immortalize her via regular doses of the potion so that they could be in love forever. He admits that he'd been in love with the Queen ever since she was a young princess, and it was only now that he'd been able to get close to her by becoming her physician. Dr. Jekyll needed the drained souls of Mr. Hyde's recently murdered victims in order to make the potion that caused the transformations, which meant that unless Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were stopped, the killings would continue and the Queen would remain missing. Soon after, Dr. Jekyll interrupts Victoria and Van Helsing's conversation only to destroy his own lair and flee with the young Queen in tow. He grabs her and escapes in the Golden Jubilee balloon sitting outside Buckingham Palace with some help from a monstrous servant. Van Helsing, not one to be deterred by heights, follows the balloon with his grapple rifle and manages to climb aboard. Dr. Jekyll transforms into Mr. Hyde inside the balloon in order to defeat and kill Van Helsing, which causes the balloon to plummet. Mr. Hyde is shot in the arm during a brawl on the Tower Bridge that is under construction, but he survives somehow and runs away. Van Helsing promises that a new dawn will undo the spell and restore Victoria to her real age when she returns to Buckingham Palace before dawn. The sun comes up and, as a reward, Victoria gives him a kiss, and she transforms back into the aged monarch as the effects of the potion wear off. The movie ends with Van Helsing tracking the monster to Paris as he sends a report of whatever transpired in London back to his base in the Vatican. The movie captures the monster hunter essence of Van Helsing in a wonderful fashion. Van Helsing is also featured in an X-Men story arc. A 4-issue limited series of comic books titled X-Men Apocalypse vs. Dracula was released by Marvel Comics in 2006. Frank Thierry wrote the series, and Clayton Henry drew the illustrations. The series focuses on an ancient battle between two ancient evils. The first of them is Apocalypse, who has plagued human civilization since the time of the pharaohs. The other is the infamous vampire Dracula, who is the most lethal being to have ever walked this world. The narrative describes how, ages ago, before Vlad Tepes became a vampire, he lost a conflict to the immortal mutant Apocalypse. However, death is simply an inconvenience to those who are immortal. Thus, in order to exact retribution for his last defeat, Dracula is transforming members of Apocalypse's family into vampires in 19th century London. In order to fight the Lord of Vampires, Apocalypse himself is awakened from his sleep, and the renowned vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing himself is by his side. Van Helsing appears in the second issue of the series as he bursts into a meeting of the Akaba clan. The members of the Akaba clan are descendants of Apocalypse. However, they're not human, they are Homo superior, a race that has mutant power similar to Apocalypse, but of course, they're nowhere near his level of strength. Seeing the string of vampiric murders, the Akaba clan is propelled into action when their current leader, Slade, goes missing. They're forced to awaken the slumbering Apocalypse, who they believe is the only one able to stop the killing of clan members. With Apocalypse awakened, Van Helsing also gets wind of the vampiric murders and he knows just who to approach: Mr. Jack, the lead investigator of the vampiric murders case. Jack is also a member of the clan, and with his help, Van Helsing is able to meet Apocalypse. The vampire hunter convinces Apocalypse that the murders are indeed the work of Dracula. However, the ancient mutant refuses to believe him, and thus Van Helsing takes him all the way to the morgue where the dead bodies were being kept. However, instead of seeing dead bodies, they're greeted by vampires, the victims who were turned into the undead. Apocalypse and Jack make short work of them with the help of Van Helsing, after which the ancient mutant finally realizes that his age-old enemy is back. The trio then head back to Alexandria House, the meeting point of the Akabe clan. In the meanwhile, in a bizarre twist of events, Slade turns up seemingly from the dead, only to introduce none other than Dracula as their new lord, hinting at the idea that he also has been bitten and turned into one of the undead. As Jack, Apocalypse and Van Helsing, accompanied by Apocalypse's servant Ozymandias, enter the house, they realize that Dracula and his undead army have already been there, seeing that the chairman of the Akabe Council, Brashear, was lying dead on the table. They're then greeted by an undead Slade, leading a vampire army. To add insult to injury, the undead army was made up of Apocalypse's disciples, all of whom had been turned into vampires. A battle ensues between Apocalypse and Slade, and the vampire army almost overcomes him before Van Helsing comes to the rescue with a cross, aided by Jack, who uses his fire breath to keep the vampires at bay. They're then teleported out of the scene of battle by the only remaining human member of the Akabe court, Slade's paralyzed brother, Frederick. Frederick teleports them to a country house from his childhood, and there, the four gear up for battle against the undead. Van Helsing begins boarding up the house and rubbing garlic all over the doors and windows in an effort to keep the part mutant, part vampire army at bay. However, after about 8 long hours of waiting, the army finally finds them and a major battle ensues. The battle goes on for hours until finally help comes in the form of a new dawn. The sun fries the vampires that were dumb enough to keep fighting until dawn, and the rest of them are hunted down by Apocalypse, Van Helsing, and Jack. Van Helsing proves to be incredibly useful as he kills the sleeping vampires as they lay slumbering in their coffins with a wooden stake. They then set all the coffins on fire, effectively wiping out all the members of the Akabe clan. That is, except for Slade, whose coffin was seemingly missing. It's in the 4th issue that Apocalypse, aided by Van Helsing and Jack, travel to Transylvania with the help of Frederick, who teleports them to where they presume Slade had fled back to. Slade had indeed been taken to Transylvania by his mother as he slept soundly in his coffin, since she was still human, or, well, simply a mutant. Unfortunately, Slade kills his mother to get back into Dracula's good books after having failed in his original mission. We also learn that Apocalypse himself was bitten by a vampire, but he dismissed it, saying he could heal from it easily by taking the help of his rejuvenation chamber. However, unbeknownst to him, his rejuvenation chamber had been destroyed, signaling that their final battle was going to be a fateful one. What ensues is an epic final battle between Dracula and his army of the undead and Apocalypse and his Riders of the Dark, a group of soldiers that were as ancient as time and hadn't been summoned for ages. They came to fight beside Apocalypse and oh my, were they deadly. In the meantime, Van Helsing, Frederick, Jack and Ozymandias enter the castle and prepare to search for Dracula. Unfortunately, they are attacked by Slade, but in a pleasant turn of events, Frederick kills Slade, taking revenge for the night that his brother had injured him, rendering him paralyzed forever. Dracula and Apocalypse finally come face to face, and after a gruesome fight, Dracula is extremely close to beating Apocalypse when Van Helsing shows up armed with holy water. He splashes the vampire with it, and Dracula recoils in pain and shock. This momentary distraction is enough for Apocalypse to impale the ancient vampire and sever his head. Van Helsing rushes to burn the head and the body separately to ensure that he's truly dead this time round. While Apocalypse was miffed that Van Helsing had intervened in his battle, he still knew that he would have lost if it were not for him. At the end of the issue, Van Helsing sets off to Canada in search of another monster to hunt down, carrying on his monster hunting legacy.
That fateful night that I realized a human could never defeat a monster.
Hotel Transylvania 3 portrayed a comedic side of Van Helsing. Professor Abraham Van Helsing, who appears in an overarching unseen role in Hotel Transylvania and Hotel Transylvania 2, is the main antagonist of Hotel Transylvania 3, Summer Vacation. Although, in this appearance, he's quite comical and far removed from the serious vampire hunter we've come to know and love. He is Erica Van Helsing's great-grandfather and a well-known monster hunter. Thanks to his kale diet and personal bodily changes, Abraham has mechanized his body significantly, outliving the average human lifespan, thereby making him virtually immortal. The only remaining human body parts of Abraham in Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation are his arms and head. along with an organ floating in some type of green fluid. Abraham is primarily moved by a robotic body and legs. He later gives up being a monster hunter though, once his great-granddaughter falls for Dracula. Abraham instructs Erica to kill Dracula throughout the movie, but in the end, he decides to carry out the act himself because Erica refuses to do so. Abraham almost achieved this by controlling the Kraken, a large sea creature. However, his scheme is thwarted when Jonathan also uses music to control the Kraken. Abraham acknowledges that not all monsters are wicked after being rescued by Dracula and makes amends. In Hotel Transylvania 3 Summer Vacation, Van Helsing is voiced by Jim Gaffigan, an American stand-up comedian, actor, writer, and producer. James Christopher Gaffigan has made a number of popular comedy specials, including Quality Time, Mr. Universe, Obsessed, and Cinco, all of which have been nominated for Grammy Awards. Interestingly, much like his choice of role, his material in stand-up is regarded as clean, using little profanity. Van Helsing has a cold attitude when it comes to Dracula and his friends, but Gaffigan finds much amusement in him. According to him, if you do research on Van Helsing, you'll see that he has an obsessive, determined, and overeducated character. The cool thing is that Gaffigan modified his natural speaking voice for the part because he believed it was too slow to convey Van Helsing's energy and intensity. In Hotel Transylvania 3, Van Helsing certainly wasn't a dangerous vampire killer, but he did provide plenty of laughs. Dracula uses his physical prowess, shapeshifts, or escapes at every opportunity, frustrating Abraham, who sustains wounds. In the end, he basically becomes a steampunk monster hunter by replacing his damaged body parts with machinery. This progression serves as a recurring reminder of Abraham Van Helsing's incapability in his quest for the largest trophy in vampire extermination. Along with Van Helsing, Erica works on a cruise ship in the Bermuda Triangle that acts as a lure to kill monsters. Erica makes numerous attempts to kill Dracula but always fails miserably, much as her grandfather did. He needs to wait for some dumb luck to happen while Erica is out falling in love with Dracula. That does happen when he discovers a relic that enables him to call out a Leviathan like a squid from the depths of the lost city of Atlantis. But that was an accident rather than the result of cunning preparation. Van Helsing 2016 TV series explores a descendant of the vampire hunter in action. This one is not centered around Van Helsing himself, however, the portrayal of his descendant, Vanessa Helsing, and the brilliant world building that the show offers makes this one a worthy mention. Van Helsing is a fantasy horror drama television show. The series was adapted from the graphic novel series Helsing by Zenescope Entertainment, and the main role of Vanessa Helsing is portrayed by Kelly Overton. Sci-Fi's Van Helsing is the show for you if you enjoy post-apocalyptic fantastical adventure narratives, Bram Stoker's Dracula, or if you simply need something fresh and gory to watch. The events of Van Helsing take place in a post-apocalyptic future. 3 years after the Yellowstone caldera eruption that covered the Earth in ash, blocked out sunlight, and allowed vampires to take over humanity, Vanessa Van Helsing, a descendant of Abraham Van Helsing, wakes from a coma after her alleged death to discover herself in a post-apocalyptic world. She is the last hope for humanity because she can transform vampires back into people thanks to the special makeup of her blood. Vanessa becomes the primary target of the vampires when they learn that she has the ability to turn them back into humans, being the only person that threatens their survival. In order for her to lead a fight against the vampires that torment the world's surviving humans, she's guarded by a Marine who has been assigned to keep her safe, and by the doctor who saved her. Thus, the show definitely sets an interesting premise for the audience. Having 5 seasons, it might be a tad bit too long for some, but the entertainment is plenty. In the 2nd season, Vanessa travels east towards Denver, Colorado, a safe haven, where she finds her long-lost sister, Scarlet, who has been raised with the ability to slay vampires. Further, the Elders, who were the first ever vampires to roam the Earth, are hunted by Vanessa and Scarlet in Season 3, in an effort to permanently eradicate them. After Vanessa's alleged demise in the 4th season, the show shifts its attention to her long-lost biological children, Violet and Jack, as they battle a new influx of vampires known as Daywalkers and the Dark One, the ruler of the vampire species who resided within the body of Countess Olivia von Dracula, along with her brides, an erstwhile Countess of Transylvania and the de facto President of the United States. Finally, in the 5th season, they face off against the Dark One. On Sci-Fi's Van Helsing, the character of Professor Abraham Van Helsing frequently appears in brief cameos across the 5 seasons. The actor who plays him is Canadian actor Michael Eklund. In the show, Van Helsing is shown to be a multi-talented Dutch physician who also happens to be a vampire hunter and the Helsing clan's first patriarch. He was regarded as the worst threat to the entire vampire race. He's portrayed as an aging yet sharp man who had once battled with Dracula and had even successfully imprisoned the malevolent entity in the Dark Realm. Van Helsing transforms from a survival horror series into a big, time-traveling fantasy with lofty themes and even greater stakes, making it a fantastic binge for fans of horror, sci-fi, fantasy, or any type of post-apocalyptic tales. Additionally, there are several fascinating flashbacks and investigations into Abraham Van Helsing's past in Michael Eklund's novel, which undoubtedly pay tribute to the character. What made Van Helsing so effective? Van Helsing was originally shown to be a learned man with vast knowledge about organisms, diseases, and, of course, vampires. He's a methodical man with a mind for research and uses his knowledge and strategic mind to take down the nasty bloodsucker. Thus, what always held him in good stead was his expansive knowledge and keen eye for detail. Over the years, his character has been adapted and modernized to become a ruthless vampire hunter with insane fighting skills. This only added to Van Helsing's effectiveness as a vampire hunter, since physical prowess is obviously a must when dealing with super powerful undead entities. With a combination of brains and brawn, in recent iterations, Van Helsing is literally an unstoppable monster hunting force. He's also shown to make use of religious artifacts and in all iterations has a strong respect for religion and is also a devout follower of God. This further aids him in his quest to take down monsters, since God is always by his side. It's been a while since Van Helsing was seen on the big screen, so maybe it's time for another film featuring this skilled vampire hunter. Would you like to see Van Helsing on the big screen once again? Let us know in the comments section below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks everyone.